Good afternoon, David, and thank you very much. What a wonderful day it is in Trinidad. The sun is absolutely beautiful. It's a little hot, but it's absolutely wonderful. I'm happy to be here, and just recently I've started co hosting this program with Karen. My background is in communication and mental wellness. But my guest today is an economist. And at the end of the program, I'm hoping that I and people in the public will understand this whole thing about economists because sometimes when they talk, I just don't understand what they're saying. So, welcome, Marla. Thank you ever so much for being with us.
Thank you, Denise. I appreciate the invitation. Are you hearing me?
Yes, we are hearing you, Marla. Yes,
Okay,
yes.
great. Okay, great. I'm grateful for the invitation, and I'm so sorry that, my field has disappointed because, you know, I'm certainly don't think that it's intentional that most economists are not understood. But here we are. Let's hope to make it better today.
And I look forward to simplifying a number of the comments that people have made. And Marlon, let me begin with asking you, tell us something about your background. I met you. Do you remember how we met?
I've been asked this question a few times by a few people lately, and I have
Oh,
to say, maybe my
okay, Marlon.
memory is, yeah,
I,
I don't remember, Denise.
we met doing UE half marathon.
Ah, yes.
That's, that's a long time ago, and it was just a wonderful experience because I was struggling and you seem to have been strong. So I was kind of running with you and started chatting and so on. But it was a wonderful experience with you, Marlon. Do you still run? Marla?
Sorry, I lost you for a second there. Yes,
Okay.
no, the half marathon was always the highlight of my year. Um, so yes, now I remember. Um, so yeah, I, fell in love with economics the first time I opened an economics textbook in A levels, which is a long time ago. I won't try to count how many years ago that was. um, and I knew that I had found my calling. I knew at that moment it was a textbook by John Beardshaw. I will never forget it. And when I opened it and started reading it, everything just made sense, and I just connected with it in a way that I've never connected with anything or anyone else since, right? Um, and I was lucky enough to work in this space in economics for my entire career at various institutions. So I consider myself to be very blessed because a lot of people, I think, don't necessarily find their calling or find their passion, at least certainly not at that age, at 16, So I feel very blessed. And it's my passion for sure. Caribbean on the whole, but of course my country. Um, you know, it holds a special place in my heart for sure.
And you just talked about the Caribbean as well as your country, but you don't
Mhm.
live here anymore. So have you given up on us?
No, I mean, I lived in Barbados for about five five years, but no, I'm no longer living in Barbados. So I am, resident, back resident in Trinidad and Tobago. I'm not in Trinidad at the moment, but Trinidad is home more so now than it was, up until middle of last year when, my kids finished school in Barbados, and so there really wasn't any need to be there anymore. So I'm
So
back.
you're back home, and I'm happy to hear
Yeah,
that you're back home. So
yeah.
welcome back. Your your 5 years in economy of Barbados, is it thriving? What is happening with it?
Um, you know, Barbados is certainly better off than it was when I first went there in, the latter half of 2018, I don't know if you remember, there was an election in, I think, May of 2018 when the Honorable Mia Amor Motley became Prime Minister. She won every single seat, which never happened in the history of Barbados. And at that time, they had almost no more foreign exchange reserves left. I think they had maybe 1 month of import cover. There was literally raw sewage in the streets in the south coast of Trinidad, of Barbados. And it really was an economy in a country and a people in crisis. And so, of course, they've come a long, long way from where they were in 2018. They defaulted, meaning the government could not pay its debts, and so they had to do a very comprehensive debt restructure exercise. It is, I think, still remains the most comprehensive debt restructure exercise known to man. And so they kind of put their debt on a more sustainable trajectory, although it's still, I don't think it's anywhere near it where it needs to be. I think that they are recovering slowly. But I have to say that I do not see where the growth impetus for Barbados is going to come from. It's an rapidly aging economy. It's one of the worst in the Caribbean in terms of the ratio of over 65-year-olds to under 25s. They have a lot of structural problems. One of them being the high cost of doing business. But it's still a very safe place to live. It's still a nice place to visit. So there's still a lot going for it. I'm just concerned about where the growth is going to come from for Barbados.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, their growth in the past was in tourism, wasn't it?
Well, it came from tourism, but also financial services. A lot of people don't necessarily think of Barbados in the financial services space. You kind of tend to think of Bahamas and Cayman, maybe. And so both tourism and financial services. And the thing about tourism, which of course I've caused lots of angst and gotten myself into all kinds of arguments and with people, especially recently, around my comments around tourism, because I'm not sure that that's a sector that actually adds value from a foreign exchange standpoint and a fiscal standpoint for the economy, simply because, especially for Barbados and Bahamas, because you import everything that the tourists consume, including the energy, including, when they switch on a light, you import everything that they consume except for the beaches and the natural environment. But also because you have foreign exchange, and those two countries in the Caribbean, you have Bahamas and Barbados, are the only two countries that have formal foreign exchange controls. Most hoteliers or anybody who earns foreign exchange, they keep their money offshore, their US dollars offshore. They only bring onshore what they need to convert to pay local bills in local currency. And so I don't know that it adds significantly to the foreign exchange reserves. And from a fiscal standpoint, these countries, these governments give lots of concessions. And we know why they give concessions, so that, the industry can thrive and people can have jobs. And certainly from a jobs perspective, the tourism sector is the largest in the Caribbean in terms of employment. But I am still concerned that it is not giving us the returns on a foreign exchange and fiscal side, the model that exists in Barbados and Bahamas. And I'm not by any means saying we shouldn't have a tourism sector. Every country on earth has a tourism sector, including some of the most isolated, like North Korea and Bhutan. But why not have a tourism sector that's more like Jamaica or Dominica or Dominican Republic, where you have more domestic linkages to the domestic economy? and domestic communities and more community-based tourism. And I think that maybe Barbados needs to think a little bit more about community-based tourism and more domestic linkages to its tourism sector.
Marla, foreign exchange and the inclusion of foreign exchange in terms of tourism. And the sense I got is that having a high level of tourism doesn't necessarily mean that that strengthens your foreign exchange. Can you please explain that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, so if tourism was such a lucrative earner of foreign exchange and it brought so much foreign exchange into your country, then why would Barbados and Bahamas need to have foreign exchange controls where they control the outflow of the foreign exchange? And the reason why it's not such, at least from what I can tell, such a lucrative net earner of foreign exchange is simply because the inputs into the tourism sector in those countries, not every country, in those countries, the inputs into the tourism sector are very high. And so the money, the foreign exchange flows back out because you have to
Okay.
import energy, import the energy to generate the electricity. You import all the food, you import all the furniture, everything that is used in the tourism sector. So if you have a more domestic component to your tourism sector, the foreign exchange situation could improve.
Okay. So what I'm hearing you say is that Barbados needs some kind of transformation in order for the economy to thrive. But that's not what we started off talking about. We went down this road of Barbados and tourism. But just before we began, there was a song by Three Canal, and I got that song based on an article that you had written. And in that article, you quoted a number of Calypsonians, from Freetown Collective and so on. What inspired you to reference Three Canals' song "Fools"?
Well, if my memory serves me correct, in that particular piece, I was trying to debunk some of the statements made by certain people in authority in Trinidad, and I was particularly concerned about some of the misinformation and disinformation that was being spewed. And this song talks about you know people in authority. We tend to listen to what they say and believe what they say, and so they have a responsibility to be honest. But are they the ones who are honest? I mean, I feel like too many times I hear, not just, and I mean, this is not me picking on Trinidad. It happens everywhere, and more so in the global north nowadays than anywhere else, to be quite honest. But you hear politicians and leaders saying things, and you're thinking, that's just so not the truth, and I wanted to use the data and the analysis of the data to show the truth. And I also wanted to make the point that we have to, as individuals, exercise our own discretion as well. And we have to, as you know, we have this expression, pick the sense from nonsense. You have to listen with a discerning and discriminating ear. And when somebody says something, don't just take it wholesale. Try and find out and think, is this really the truth? Be a little suspicious and go digging for the data to find out if what you're being told is actually the truth or not. Otherwise, then you are complicit in being fooled if we don't do that. That's why I quoted that song. And thank God for, all of the creative people we have in my country, like Three Canal and Wendell Manwaran and his team, and Freetown Collective and David Rudder and or I can't, of course, there are too many to mention, but
Yes.
the people who in Trinidad and Tobago are, I guess, a voice of all of our consciousness. Thank God for them, because they can express things in a way that we can relate to, and we feel like we are also able to express what they are expressing. But of course, we can't do it the way they do it. I certainly can't. So I'm grateful that they said that, because it was everything I wanted to say. Of course, they look and sound a whole lot better than me.
Yes, they do, because they have rhythm, they have the songs, they have the words, and so on. But Marla, can
Exactly.
you think of any example of what you are referencing that you talked about? Fool, you have to be careful and select, and they can't tell you things that may think you are a fool. Can you think of anything that came to your mind?
Well, one of the things that I would say consistently when people ask me, how things are doing, how do you think things are in Trinidad? We're doing well, right? Because the authorities say everything's fine, and the IMF came and published this report, and then the Ministry of Finance put out their spin on the report, and it sounds like everything's great. I just asked the question, what about you? I mean, you live in Trinidad and Tobago. How do you feel? Do you feel things are getting better? Do you feel safer? Do you feel happier? Do you feel like there's more opportunity? Do you feel like it's a place you would want to raise your children and grandchildren? Do you feel like you would want to, um, you know, do more and invest more of what you earn into this country? And that's the answer. Whatever your answer is the answer you're looking for. And I think that, you know, there is a segment of the population, I'm sure, who feels like things are better, and they might feel safer, they might feel happier, and they might feel like they have more opportunity. But I think, based on my analysis of the data, I don't think that we're doing better, because you can talk about, okay, we're growing faster this year than we did last year, or inflation is lower, unemployment is low. You can talk about all of these economic statistics, but do they really matter? Does it matter when the homicide rate is as high as it is, the detection rate is as poor as it is? What the detection rate is in the single digits, if my memory serves me correct. And then, of the detection rate, meaning of all crime detected, how many convictions there are out of that. So it's all well and good to say, we're growing by 2 and 3%, and unemployment is 4%, and inflation is whatever it is, it's 5%, it's low. But why haven't we measured poverty since I don't want to say the wrong thing, but I think we haven't measured poverty since 2014. There it is.
Just
And it
hold a minute.
was,
Hold a minute, hold a minute,
yeah,
Marla. Saying
yeah.
we have not measured poverty since 2014. Could you explain to our viewers what is this measurement of poverty? How is that done? What does it mean?
So, okay, before I get into the measurement, every time that we elect a government, we elect a government based on who we think will do their best and do the right thing for our country and make our lives better, right? I would imagine that's why we elect people. That's why I,
Yeah.
vote, because I vote for who I think will do what's right for my country and make my life better, make our collective lives better. Measuring poverty is one of the ways in which you can show whether or not people's lives are getting better or people's lives are getting worse. The poverty measure tells you how many people are living below a certain income level, right? And if you are having a higher and higher poverty rate every year, then it means more and more people are living below that income level, meaning more and more people are not able to afford basic things, and they are quote unquote poor. Now, of course, all of these measures and all of these definitions and terminology is loaded, right? Because, for example, in Guyana, you have people who live in the hinterland who grow everything they eat and eat everything they grow, and people might say they are poor because they're below the poverty level in terms of their income per day, but they're not poor. They're better off than us because they have all their needs met. So we have some problems with the definition of poverty, but the fact of the matter is poverty is one of the ways in which you measure the how well your people are doing versus are not doing. And if you are not measuring poverty for the past 10 years, and how do you know if more people are becoming poor, and if in other words, if your policies are working? So your policy to, for example, build a highway somewhere, your policy of reducing the fuel subsidy, your policy of whatever government policies are, if people's lives are not being made better, then then maybe your policy mix is wrong, and it's damaging. So it's important to measure poverty to know whether you're on the right track. And if you're not on the right track, then you have to figure out what's gonna make things better. But if we refuse to measure it, Denise, then how do you know? Then, in other words, you're shooting in the dark. You're making policies in a vacuum, and you're maybe making some people's lives better, but if you're not measuring, how would you know?
Exactly. I am amazed to hear you say that it is since 2014 we measured poverty,
Yeah.
because if we don't have the data, then we can't create the kind of social changes that are needed. We can't even give people the economic support that they need and so on. So when you talk about it not being measured since 2014, then do you know if there's a global measurement and where Trinidad and Tobago would be on that level of poverty globally?
Um, well, there is a global measure. I don't remember what it is right now. I mean, we know that poverty increased during the pandemic, right? And we know that poverty got worse in most countries that measured poverty. But I mean, it was almost 25% when we measured it in 2014. And if it got worse during the pandemic, then where is it now? And is it that you're saying 1 in 4 of us is poor in Trinidad and Tobago? I mean, I remember when that statistic came out, a lot of people thought that's crazy. It could never be that high. And I just thought maybe we live in a bubble. Maybe it is that high because the people who measured it are credible. So maybe it is that we are actually missing what's really going on and we're not addressing it properly. So I to answer your question, it is, I don't know how we compare, but I know that I thought I would pull it up, but I know I wrote about it with the World Bank recently about how in the Caribbean, so this is not just a Trinidad and Tobago problem, many countries across the Caribbean, except Jamaica and Dominican Republic, are not good at, even Barbados, not measuring poverty. And if you're not measuring it, you don't know how you're doing. It's almost like the poverty measures a scorecard of
Yeah.
politicians' success or failure at managing the economy. Because if the poverty rate goes up during your tenure, you know you have done something wrong.
Yeah, yeah, and there's that Peter Drucker statement that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And
Exactly.
if you're not measuring poverty, then how do you manage your entire country? And in my head, there's quite an association between poverty and crime, and to
There
me,
is and there isn't. There is and there isn't. And that's a very interesting point you make. But the thing about it is, Denise, before we go into that, I mean, it's one thing to say you can't measure, you haven't measured. I think it's a policy choice on the part of some of the governments in this region where they refuse to measure it because they know what it's going to show and they don't want it to show, and they don't want that kind of a scorecard. They don't want to come home with a F on their report card and get licks, right? That's the way I see it. I feel some governments just don't want to measure it. Now, with respect to the association between poverty and crime, I think that when you look back at homicide rate, our homicide rate was at its highest in some of the years when we had the most growth in our economy, which tells you that now growth is not the same as poverty, but it tells you that even when the economy is doing well, the homicide rate was at its highest. So then there is a disconnect. And I think that it's important for us to remember that, yes, there are social problems that would drive people towards crime, not just poverty, so addiction and things like that, that could result in higher levels of crime. But it is not just crime that is a association with poverty. It's an association with something much wider in our region. Because remember, we in the Caribbean sit in the middle between the producers of narcotics in the south and the consumers of the narcotics in the north. I mean, we do not consume as much cocaine per capita as the global north, right? So we are stuck in the middle of this very large and lucrative narcotics trade. And so you have drugs and guns flowing from the south, north, and the money and the guns, sorry, drugs flowing north, and then the money and the guns flowing south to protect the money and to protect the drugs. And we're caught in the middle. And so I think that a large part of the crime, the violent crime, the homicides in particular that we see in Trinidad and Tobago and in Jamaica, we know as well, is related to the narcotics trade, and it is not just a reflection of poverty.
But Marla, the narcotics trade is not part of the formal economy. I'm asking the question.
Absolutely not.
So
Mm-mm.
how does a country manage that informal trade that is happening, that is money is passing through and impacting your country? How do you manage that? What do you do?
Well, yeah, you can't. But I think that when you think about Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm so sorry that Karen is not here with us today, because I remember some time ago she said that Trinidad and Tobago is a narco state. And to be very honest with you, I was relieved to hear her say that, because I was thinking it and I was saying it in private fora, not publicly. Now I can say it publicly and quote her.
And nobody will sue you.
Right. Because when you look at, for example, you look at the amount of vehicles parked in the airport, you look at the amount of cars at the mall, if we're supposedly not growing and the economy is not doing well, where is all of this liquidity coming from? And the fact that there is a large informal sector. Now, the informal sector was measured some years ago to be somewhere between one quarter and one third of all economic activity that takes place in our country, right? Roughly a quarter or a third of all the economic activity you see is estimated to be in the informal sector. What is the informal sector? It is the sector that is not on the books. It's the people who are working as, let's say, domestic workers or hairdressers or doubles vendors or any kind of vendor, and they are not doing NIS and VAT and income tax. They're completely off the book. They're not registered as a company or registered anywhere. That's the informal sector. So that's not necessarily illegal. Like being a domestic worker off the books is not necessarily an illegal activity. But so you have an informal sector that's across the Caribbean, very large. You have countries like Haiti, it's the largest part of the sector of the economy. And then you have countries where the informal sector is, much smaller, like 10 or 15%. So let's say we are a third of the activity you see is informal. What that means is that this sector is not captured by the income tax network and the NIS network, but they would be captured when they spend and they pay VAT, right? So they still contribute to taxes, but they're not contributing to some of the other things that we contribute to. Fine, but that's not illegal. Then you have the illegal, informal, underground economy, which is illegal. We know we have human trafficking, we know we have weapons trafficking, we know we have drug trafficking, and all of that is not the informal sector, but that's the illegal sector of the economy. And I think that the liquidity coming out of that sector, not the legal informal sector, that illegal activity is large. And remember that liquidity can't be banked. So that's not in bank accounts largely. It's under mattresses and it's in suitcases, and it's, being spent because it has to be spent, because it cannot be saved, because it's not legal. So generally you can't deposit millions and millions of dollars that you've made from drug trading, because it's, you have to show a business that can deposit that. And of course we have some of that happening as well. We have some money laundering, as you know. I mean, the authorities talk about it all the time, how many FIU, the Financial Intelligence Unit, talks all the time about the amount of cases they've reported every year of suspicious transactions and so on. So we do have a lot of money laundering. So we have a huge informal and illegal sector, which is why when Karen said, we are a narco state, she's right. There is, and she spoke about how she arrived at that conclusion. But I can tell you, when she said it, I thought, yeah, you're right, because you can see it.
So, in saying that we are narco state, it means that drug money is coming in and passing through the economy. And that is
It
likely.
means it's a big part of our economy, yeah.
Yeah. But is that likely to be foreign dollars? That's not local dollars.
That has to be foreign currency, because, okay, so whoever's growing and producing the drugs, they can't use TT dollars.
No.
It's just passing through us in the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago included. It's passing through us. The people who consume these narcotics are in the global north. So it's US dollars, Canadian dollars, pounds sterling, euros, and they're paying for it in that currency, hard currency. And so that hard currency has to go back to the people who produce the narcotics.
Tell me how that currency, that foreign currency, those hard dollars, how do those hard dollars move? Is it that they're physically just moving it? Or are some of those dollars going through our formal system?
Well, I think both, because, and this is why we've had reports, not just in Trinidad and Tobago, but other countries all over the Caribbean. That's why we have an FIU. That's why the banks are obligated to, once you make a deposit over a certain amount, you have to do a declaration saying where you got this money. That's why we have so much anti-money laundering legislation and regulations in place, so that we can pick up on when this dirty money is trying to enter the formal financial system. But some of it still makes its way in, simply because you have businesses that are created for the purpose of laundering money. And so shell, or front, ever heard that expression? It's just a front, because there are businesses that are created to show that I'm a business and I'm supposed to be able to deposit X number of dollars every day from sales, but in fact, I'm really not selling that much. But some of that is, there are all kinds of creative ways that people in this business use to launder money. But money laundering is a big problem across the Caribbean. Again, simply because of where we are geographically. I mean, you would have seen, was it a year or more ago, that the premier of the British Virgin Islands was caught in a sting operation by undercover agents, saying, this is not my first rodeo, and he's a premier, he's a prime minister, basically, and he's not
That,
the only
that
one.
one, When I saw that, I was amazed that this is the leadership of a country. Someone who, for me, the leader is someone who is morally upright. He's someone who I want to be like that person because they do everything right, because they treat other people with respect and so on. And to see that he ends up as a criminal, and it really made me start to think, to what extent is that happening in our region? Nobody knows, I don't know. But it suddenly made me start to think through, well, really, to what extent is it happening and what can the citizen do? Because if our leaders are involved in these issues, then we're in trouble. We're in big trouble, and I'm not sure what
Absolutely.
citizens can do.
Well, I think as individual citizens, first of all, we have to exercise we have to be careful when we vote, right? And make sure that we vote for the right reasons, not because of ethnicity or anything as irrelevant as that, as it relates to voting. Um, I think that in economics, we believe in the power of incentives. And if you have a country where the detection rate is in the single digits, meaning less than 10% of every crime ends up being detected, meaning there's an arrest. And then the conviction rate is a fraction of that detection rate. Then any individual who has, any individual, not even those who don't have opportunity, because obviously the premier prime minister is full of opportunity, right? There's no shortage of opportunity for somebody of that stature. When an individual is faced with a choice, I can choose to stay on the straight and narrow, or I can choose to do what my brother over here is doing, working deals and letting the drugs pass and saying it's not my first rodeo and he's making lots of money. I think it's a choice that each of us has to make, right? So that's what as individuals we can do. We make the right choices. But then remember, when you have a detection rate that is so poor, then individuals make a calculated choice. If I do this, what are the odds that I get caught? Actually quite low. Well, then maybe I will go ahead and do it. And so when you look at Jamaica, for example, Jamaica, there was a study published that talked about the homicide rate falling when the detection rate went up, meaning that when the police do their job, that's when violent crime falls. So, Denise, I think that it's not about us as individuals, it's about the institutions in our country. The police service, the judiciary, the legal system on the whole has to work. And if it's working properly, if our institutions are functioning properly, that's when our country will do better. Largely, a country's success or failure. There's a book called Why Nations Fail, and they talk about the fact that the countries that have better functioning societies are the ones that have strong institutions. And if you have institutions that are being eroded by, and what are institutions? Institutions are laws and guidelines and people, right? And if you have laws or guidelines that are being eroded, if you have people who are corrupt, then the institutions crumble. And I believe there has been a lot of erosion of institutions across the region since I've been paying attention. Jamaica is the one exception in my mind. And you would notice that Jamaica has done remarkably well in the past 10 years. It's the only country in the Caribbean that I think has made the kind of progress that they've made across all countries, Dominican Republic as well. But Jamaica has come a long way. And part of the reason is because they deliberately strengthened their institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, so to answer your question, it's not something so much that the individual can do, but the collective And also, I think that as a region, we need to cooperate to solve this problem, because this is a regional problem. It's not just a Trinidad problem or a Jamaica problem. These drugs will go through whoever's the weakest link. And so we all have to be strong. So,
But there's also the statement that Trinidad's geographic location makes Trinidad a primary place for the passage of the drugs because of our closeness to South America and to Latin America, that most of the drugs and so on pass within 8 to 10 miles of our shores. So
yes.
that although it requires regional cooperation, Trinidad seems to have a kind of a special position on this. But Marla, when we talk about this and the institutions, I keep seeing attempts to strengthen our institutions. And it seems as if it seems as if that's not working. I'll give you an example of why I think it's not working. We had the procurement legislation, and that procurement legislation was cut down to such an extent that it, to me, just doesn't make much
It,
sense right now.
why bother?
Why bother, you know? And then the other side of it is for you to get registered with that under that procurement legislation is painful. You know, when you go through the system, you're always having iterations. You have to go back and do this, check that. You still have to phone. And when you're registered and you put in a proposal or you respond to an RFP, you still have to go through and give a whole set of documentation. So the last time I had to do that, I asked myself, so why did I go through the procurement system if I still now have to go and present all the documentation? You know, so our institutions, I don't know how we are going to transform our institutions. You know, I don't know which country has transformed their institutions in a way. You said Jamaica did it, but what would we need to do to transform our institutions?
Well, Denise, I think that in the first place, it has to come from the leadership, and the leadership has to be the right people. If leaders are not strengthening their institutions, then they're not the ones for the job. If that's what we want, I think that reform is something that politicians and leaders in this region are not necessarily comfortable with. And the thing is, reform is necessary because we're constantly changing, so we have to constantly reform. But there are glaring needs for reforms that are not undertaken. And I think that, going back to the fact that we refuse to measure poverty, nobody has to tell a government when to measure poverty. They should just decide, listen, we inherited this, we won an election, we don't know what poverty is, we want to know what we should do to make our country better, let's measure it so that we can determine who is poor, where are they, what is their gender, what is their age, what is the reason they're poor? Is it that they're handicapped? Is it that they lack education? So that's what a poverty assessment will do. It'll tell you all of these things so that then you can craft policy to fix it. My point to you is, it is up to the leadership to make those kinds of decisions around leading and making a country better. And if you don't reform and improve your institutions like Jamaica did, then, and I think sometimes it's deliberate. I'm sorry to say, and I'm not just targeting Trinidad here, I see it across the region. Sometimes it's deliberate, where our leadership does not want to do the things necessary because they don't want to be held accountable. They don't want to do what is difficult to do, because it's not easy to do these things. It's not easy to measure something that shows that you've failed in some way and you can lose the next election because of it, but you do it because it's the right thing to do. It's not easy to reform an institution. In Jamaica, for example, they've done lots of civil service, public sector reform. They've reformed the central bank and the way that the currency is managed. They've reformed their labor market. They've reformed their customs. They've done so much reform and institutional strengthening, and that is fundamental to why Jamaica is doing better.
But tell
But it's
me,
not easy.
what was the inspiration for them to do it? Was
So
it
the inspiration, yeah, no, nothing as powerful as necessity. So Jamaica ran into what is called in my world a balance of payments crisis, meaning they had no foreign exchange. In 2011, I think it was 2012, somewhere around there, they had nothing left. They had gone to the IMF X amount of times, I don't remember, and they kept taking the money from the IMF, not doing what the IMF said they should do to make things better. And they got to a point where they ran out of money again because, of course, they didn't reform. And then they run out of foreign exchange. They can't pay for oil and gas to come in and put on the lights. They can't pay for medicine. And then go to the banks to say, can we borrow money? And the bank said, you know what, hold up, selector. Nothing for you. We done. We tired of this. You keep borrowing money and then you run into this problem. You can't pay us back. So if you want our money, you have to stick to the IMF reform measures. And that's what happened. They eventually sat down, formed what is called the EPOC, Economic Policy Program Oversight Committee, where you had government and private sector, civil society all come together to basically what this EPOC does. And I did an interview with Keith Duncan, who is the president of the EPOC. It's on my YouTube channel, where he talked about this journey. And he talked about every quarter, every 3 months, he goes publicly on the corner by the rum shop and says, well, this is what the government said they were going to do this quarter. And this is what they did. This is what the goals they met. These are the goals they didn't meet. This is why. And so that epoch drove accountability, and it did so publicly, not privately. And that public accountability for a government meeting its targets is what I think was one of the crucial, if not the most important reason why Jamaica has improved to where it is now. Jamaica now has its lowest poverty rate ever, even after the pandemic. They have their lowest unemployment rate ever. Their debt to GDP is the lowest it's been in my lifetime, I think. I have friends in Jamaica who said they never thought in their lifetime their country would do so well.
And you're talking about Jamaica. Let's come home to
2.8 million people, twice the size
yeah.
of Trinidad. Mm-hmm.
And so I want to know, what are your thoughts about where are we going? Because you said that Jamaica reached a stage where they didn't have enough foreign exchange to buy energy, so that would have impacted the man in the street. They couldn't turn on their electricity. We're not there, but we are importing fuel. And if we have a foreign exchange problem, we may get to that. So what do you think is going to happen to the Trinidad economy?
Well, in preparation for this interview, I went and looked at some data. And one of the scariest things I would say to you is that right now, if Trinidad and Tobago wasn't borrowing US dollars or wasn't drawing US dollars down from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, our foreign exchange reserves would be close to zero.
Marla,
Yeah.
Marla,
Yes.
think of me as a man in the street, someone who don't, you just said it's close to zero. If
If
we
we
weren't
weren't
borrowing,
borrowing and
you
drawing down
know,
from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. So, okay, so what are foreign exchange reserves? Our country earns foreign exchange from exports, right? Like any country would. But we also earn foreign exchange from borrowing foreign exchange, right? So those are the two main sources of foreign exchange for any country in the Caribbean: what you earn from your exports and what you borrow. There's also foreign direct investment that comes in, but we put that one aside for now because that's something we don't really have control over too much. So our government can borrow and our country can earn foreign exchange. And in Trinidad and Tobago, our government gets paid some of its taxes from the energy sector in foreign exchange, right? So let's say, the BPs and the BHPs and, all of the producers of oil and gas pay their taxes, a large proportion of which in foreign exchange to the government. And the government gives those foreign dollars, those US dollars, to the central bank, and the central bank holds it in reserves. And this is the money that the central bank sells to the banks so that we can go to the banks and buy US dollars to go abroad, to pay for surgery or whatever medical treatment abroad, to send our kids to school abroad, etc., etc. Right? That's how our economy works in terms of the foreign exchange. But we have steadily eroded how much reserves we have, to the point that all the reserves we have right now, today, the 8th of April, 2024, almost all the reserves we have right now at the central bank is not what we earned from exports. It's what our governments have borrowed and what we have drawn down from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund.
Okay. Let's see if we can look at that as an individual. So what you're saying is, for instance, I couldn't borrow money to pay my electricity bill
Of
because,
course not.
so to me, that's what I'm hearing you say, that the country is not earning enough foreign exchange. So we're borrowing foreign exchange. And a stupid question, what are we using as the asset to be able to borrow that money as a country?
Well, not all of our foreign exchange borrowing will be backed by assets. What usually people who buy, a bond that the government issues in US dollars, what they look at, sometimes they're backed by assets, sometimes they're not. They look at what the government's earnings are and how what their track record has been in terms of paying their debts, etc., etc. And a lot of times they look at the fact that we have a Heritage and Stabilization Fund of 5+ billion US dollars. And they think, well, okay, this bond is only $500 million. They have 5 billion sitting in a Heritage and Stabilization Fund that they could use. They have a piggy bank that they can use to pay me back, so it's risk-free. Or the risk is low that I won't be repaid, so why not? So the asset implicitly is the Heritage and Stabilization Fund.
Okay, let's just transfer a bit, go to the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. That came from our earnings from energy and oil and gas.
Correct.
But wasn't it put together there so that when we're in trouble, we could use it?
There are two elements to this Heritage and Stabilization Fund. It's heritage and stabilization. The stabilization element, which is supposed to be the smaller part of the fund, I think it's not supposed to be more than $1 billion US or so, is that part that you just talked about. It's there for a rainy day. It's there if the COVID hits, right? And the government has to shut the country down and cannot earn VAT revenue and income tax revenue and corporate tax revenue, but needs revenue to import all the vaccines and do everything that it does. And so it dips into the stabilization part of the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. The heritage element, which is supposed to be the bulk of it, which, I guess now would be upwards of 4 billion, is the part of the fund from a philosophical standpoint that was created to ensure something called intergenerational equity. Meaning that us right now, Denise, we are benefiting from the oil coming out of and gas coming out of the ground, right? But all of the little Trinidadians and Tobagonians who are not yet born 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, they are just as entitled to this oil and gas bounty as we are. If we don't save some of what we're earning, and we deplete, it is a depleting natural resource. If we don't save some of what we're earning now for them in the future, then we will not have intergenerational equity. We will have a situation where we are better off than they will be. And so we have to save some for them so that they can be they can benefit from it almost equally as we are. But as it stands now, 5 billion US dollars does not ensure intergenerational equity because it's a lot less than we benefited from in the past 100 years that we've been mining oil and gas, and certainly not what our government spends every year in terms of fiscal spending based on what it earns from the oil and gas sector. So already we failed at intergenerational equity. but at least we have something that is supposed to be saved for the long term.
Mm. Mala, is there any country in which there is that intergenerational equity that they've been able to have the funds so that the future generations will benefit from like oil and gas?
Yeah, so the country that everybody talks about with respect to sovereign wealth funds is Norway. As
Hmm.
Norway, again, has a small population. I think their population is somewhere like 5 million or something like that. It's not very big. But they have $1 trillion, over $1 trillion. I mean, and they're very cautious about how they spend their sovereign wealth fund. So I remember so they have to go to a referendum to ask the people every time they want to access it. And I think this is an extreme case, right? Because I don't know that that's necessarily the best way if you have development needs. But clearly, Norway can finance its development needs from its recurrent revenue that the government earns, so they don't need to tap into it. So they have this money that's just saving there. So all the future Norwegians are very well looked after. So that's one perfect example. Then you have on the other, I always say sovereign wealth funds lie on the spectrum with Norway on one end and Guyana on the other end, where as fast as they put in, they take it back out, which defeats the whole purpose of a sovereign wealth fund. They're treating it like a checking account. We are somewhere in the middle.
That is interesting. But Mala, I want to go back to you saying that we would have zero foreign exchange, because that is not what I have heard the government talk about. So that you saying that we have zero foreign exchange is really challenging what the government says, what the Minister of Finance says.
So what I said was not that we have zero. Huh? What I said was if we weren't borrowing or drawing from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, then our level of reserve would be close to zero right now. If you look so right now we have somewhere at the end of August, I think it was, we have somewhere around 6 billion
That's
US
August.
dollars in, yeah. We have somewhere around 6 billion um, US dollars in reserves. But like I said, it's almost all borrowed or drawn from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, which means we're not earning enough from our exports to maintain our level of imports. That's basically what it's saying. And we're steadily declining. I mean, I think it peaked from what I'm seeing on this chart here, I think it peaked in 2014. And it's been on a almost steady decline since then. And so what does this mean, Denise? I mean, to the average person, of course, we know that Trinidad is the country in the Caribbean that is most difficult to get foreign exchange. And I mean, it means that businesses can't get enough foreign currency to pay for their imports. It means that people who want to travel can't get enough foreign currency to spend when they're abroad. Um, and the thing is, in a situation like this, where there is so much demand for something that is in limited supply, the price should go up, no?
Yeah.
Meaning the price of a US dollar should move.
Ooh, but it has, yeah.
It's been held steady at about 6.8 for a few years well. And let me tell you, when was the last time? And so that means that it's being artificially propped up at this level, which is obviously not healthy. It was somewhere around 2012, I think, was when the last time we changed and it was incremental changes back then anyway. So it means that you have demand that is getting larger and larger at this price of 6.8, TT dollars to one US dollar. But the government has taken a policy decision not to depreciate the currency, not to let it move. You remember a time it used to change very slightly over time. Nobody even took notice. Nobody cared. It never caused inflation. And then somehow in 2012, I think it was, that the authorities decided, let's just stop the auction mechanism and let's just freeze the price and leave it there and hope something doesn't break, but a lot has broken. I
Yes.
mean, yeah.
My concern with the foreign exchange issue that we have is when I think through the amount of food that we need foreign exchange to bring in, to me, that is going to be our first point of difficulty when we are unable to pay for the food that we're bringing in because we're still importing a lot of food. And that means we need foreign exchange to bring that food in. And what's going to happen when we can't do that? You know,
So what tends to happen, like if you look at when a country is getting closer and closer to where Barbados was in 2018, where they had no more foreign exchange, and then it happened to Suriname in I think 2020. Those were the two most recent balance of payments crises in the Caribbean. Food is not the thing that suffers, at least not first. What you will start seeing is that people who buy foreign currency to pay for their bills will start getting less and less, or they will have to take longer and longer to get the money that they need from the banks or the central bank, as the case may be in Barbados. It was the central bank. And so then imports of other things as well, not just food, start suffering. And then you will see the government, for example, not honoring its own bills in US dollars. So you have debt that it has to repay or other foreign payments it will have to make, and it will slow down on these payments until you get to a point where, for example, in Barbados's case, Barbados imports oil and gas to make electricity, and then you just don't have enough, and you certainly don't have enough to pay your debts, and then you have to wave a white flag and say, okay, I don't have enough money and I need help. So I don't think we should worry too much about the food. I think generally when the central bank recognizes that things are getting tight in terms of foreign exchange liquidity, they tend to start prioritizing things like food and medicine, and less so things like vehicles and construction material and debt repayments and things like that.
there's a story that I have told, and that is that I needed a particular part for my car, and the person who brought in the car, the company that brought in the car, didn't have it, and it took about 3 months. And there were other companies that bring in the parts, and when I went to one of them, they said we just don't have the foreign exchange to bring in the parts. Now, to me, that is an indication of what is happening with our foreign exchange. So
Mm-hmm.
that, and there's no system that says to this car importer, the main car importer, that if you're bringing in cars, then you know that after 100 whatever kilometers, they're going to need to change this and they're going to need to change that. Therefore, you have to have that so that people can go and get it. And nobody tells them that. And when you go to these companies and you ask, I've come for so and so part, they look at you and say, Miss, we don't have that. And that's the end of that. So you end up with a car that you can't drive because if you continue to drive, it just gets worse. And all that the person over the counter is saying, Miss, we don't have that. We don't know when we go get. And that kind of thing to me is an indication that the foreign exchange crisis is becoming more and more real, which is why I thought it would end up with food. But you're saying that it's unlikely. Central bank will try and sort that out.
Yeah, I've not seen that happen anywhere in the Caribbean, to be very honest, where we didn't, we had a problem with food imports as a result of a balance of payments crisis. So I don't think we need to worry too much about that. And luckily, Trinidad does have, a fairly robust agriculture sector compared to some of the other islands.
Okay, that may be so. I'll give you another example. But we're
Hmm.
importing avocado. And every time I buy an imported avocado, I waste money because
Yeah.
it doesn't ripe properly and so on.
It's
Anyway,
not a pollock that you picked in the backyard. It will never be the same.
but I'm seeing avocados with a stamp on it that says where it came from. I never thought that our country would be importing something like avocado, but that's where we are. But Marla, we've been talking about all the problems. If you had to make some suggestion as to what Trinidad needs to do, what would you suggest?
I think one of the most powerful things you can do, and I've seen it in the case of Jamaica, as I highlighted earlier, and I've seen it in other countries. I think one of the most powerful things you can do is hold the authorities to account. I think if we would get together and have the private sector, the civil society, even the opposition and the ruling administration come to the table and form something like Jamaica's EPOC, Economic Program Oversight Committee, and say, okay, this was your budget, this is what you said you're going to do, and every quarter we're going to go live to the people on Denise's show and say, this is what you said you were going to do, this is what you did, this is what you didn't do, you need to tell us why, and you need to tell us what you're going to do better next quarter. I think that level of accountability for performance is just like children coming home with their report card, right? It's the same thing. It's the same principle. If nobody is holding the authorities to account for doing what they say they're going to do, then they'll do whatever they want to do, right? And then also beyond that is making sure that what they say they're going to do is the right thing. And I think a mechanism like the EPOC, where you have the major stakeholders in society represented, where they have a view, which is what really is supposed to happen, between an MP and its constituents, but doesn't. It's the same mechanism where we can feed back to the authorities. Well, here's what I think are the problems you need to be addressing, and here are our ideas as to how you can solve them. Because I don't have a monopoly on ideas, and I don't know what all the problems are. But I think that if you have some kind of a mechanism where you get all the major stakeholders to represent the people who they represent to you and tell you what their problems are and what they think the solutions can be, and we all come together to decide on the priorities of these solutions, and then you hold the government accountable for implementing these solutions, then we might get somewhere.
But my concern with that is was that a voluntary thing, or who said that that had to happen? Who put that in place? It was the IMF, wasn't it?
Um, no, from what I recall, I have to go back and listen to the interview with Keith Duncan. From what I recall, the private sector, the banks, who the government was asking for money, and the Chamber of Commerce, it's called the PSOJ, I think, in Jamaica, Private Sector Organization of Jamaica. They were the ones who said, listen, if you want us to support you, then we all have to come to the table and we all have to hold you to account for what you say you're going to do. Because we're lending you this money on the basis that you will be able to pay us back at some point in the future. But to be able to pay us back, you can't be doing the same foolishness you're doing now. So you have to change. And so we're here to hold you account for changing. And I think it was driven by the private sector. Yes, I think it's voluntary, those who sit on it. But it represents a cross section of the society, civil society, and etc.
That is an amazing approach. And if it could happen in Jamaica, it certainly can happen in Trinidad. But we're going to need to have somebody or some set of people understanding it and saying that this is what we need to do if we're going to transform our society.
The problem in Trinidad is that I think you have pockets of people who would want to do something like this, but I think that unless everybody comes together and then goes to the government and says, this is what we're going to do, we're going to hold you account publicly, I think you have the risk of, because remember, somebody said it the other day, we don't have a democracy, we have a contractocracy. Everybody's studying their government contract. And so if I appear on this committee, I mightn't get a contract.
Yeah.
So we have to be brave, and we have to have courage, and we have to be able to stand up and say, I might lose business, but this is what's right for my country. It can't be people like Afro Raymond doing it alone all the time. right? So I think it would require some brave people coming together. But I think if, like you said, if Jamaica could do it, why can't we? But then Jamaicans are tough people.
Yeah. Well, one of our problems, our Calypsonians, for carnival, they complaining about different things and so on. And I think once they put it out there on stage, that's the end of it. Once we've sung about it, then it's all right, which is not really what should be happening. You hear things that people sing about, and then that's the end of that. So there has to be a transformation of our country. But when I look around, I am not seeing, from my understanding, we earn foreign exchange from oil and gas, and that is problematic at the moment. We earn some more foreign exchange from some of the things that we manufacture and export, but that is not large enough. So I keep asking myself, what is it that we can do? What are we seeing that will improve our level of foreign exchange and therefore help us to survive? Can you think of anything that you're seeing being done that you think will make a difference to the economy?
Well, I
You
think
took
in
a
the
deep breath.
first place, yeah, I think, yeah, it's a big question. I mean, I think in the first place, when you have an export that is 80% of what you earn in foreign exchange, or 80, roughly 80, on average, 80% of what we export is oil and gas, and therefore 80% of what we earn in foreign exchange is based on oil and gas. Then you know that you have a big risk, right? That your eggs are almost all in one basket. And if you have a big risk, then how do you mitigate that risk? Well, you save plenty so that when that egg cracks, you have something to fall back on, as you talked about earlier, which is what the stabilization element of the HSF is supposed to be for. But then again, if you only save 5 billion, that is not plenty. We should have had 500 billion,
You
right?
mean that?
Ladies, let me interject here. I have a call on the line.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, caller.
Good afternoon. Just a quick comment or question or statement I would like to pose to you and Denise, if you all could just give me some feedback, because I believe that at the beginning of this administration's term in office, the first term in office, they did set up an economic advisory board or committee or something of that sort, which they quickly dissolved after they came with some recommendations. So if they're willing to not listen to economic advisors in that sense, at that stage, what would make them listen to them now?
That's
Such a brilliant point. Of course, it's a brilliant point. You make a brilliant point. It's true. And you had people like Terence Farrell and Ronald Ramkissoon and Marlene Arts on that Economic Development Advisory Board, from what I recall. So you had bright people who understand how this country works. And if the authorities constituted this committee and then they don't listen to them, then why bother? So yeah,
Well, so
we're not ready. We're not ready. We're
what
not
makes
ready.
Jamaica different? So what, in other words, what did Jamaica do that the government have no choice? Whoever the government is, whether it's the ruling party or another party come in, and that they have to listen to this epoch, as you call it, or whatever the name is in Jamaica. What
Yeah.
do we need to do to get that effect here in Trinidad? Or our prime minister could just say, "Me like what you're saying," and I moving on. Thanks for your time.
Yes, and you're right. And there have been times when people like myself and other economists, like
That's what,
Roger Hossain, Terence Farrell, have tried to hold the government to account by pointing out, where they failed or where they should have done things differently. And then what happens? We get attacked. And we don't get, and you know what, I would love if I got attacked based on the data and the analysis, but no, you get attacked based on your person and your character. Um, and so, in an attempt to undermine your credibility. So I think that, in the first place, you have to have people who are brave enough to come together, brave enough to say, irrespective of the attacks that they will get, brave enough to stand up and say, this is what the government said they would do with the budget, for example. and this is what they've done, and this is what they haven't done, and this is where they've gone wrong, and this is where they've gone right. It requires a level of courage. And I think that, initially, of course, the government will push back and attack. But I think if you keep at it and enough people appreciate what you're doing, then it will stick. And that's what happened in Jamaica. But are we ready as a people for Trinidad and Tobago? Would you support a committee like that? Or when somebody from government says, what does he know or what does she know, and why they don't, stay quiet or whatever, when they say things that to try and discredit the individuals as opposed to dealing with the substance of what they've said, would you laugh? Or would you say, no, I don't want to hear you say foolishness like this. I want to hear what they have to say, and I want you to answer me as to why you haven't done what you said you were going to do. What is the reaction of the public going to be? And that's why sometimes I think maybe we're just not ready for something like that. But Jamaica was ready because they hit rock bottom at that time. And so they were
So,
ready.
Marla,
And it
you're really saying that we have to hit rock bottom. Things have to get worse before we
I
can
didn't
even.
say that. I didn't say that. I didn't say that, Denise. I don't think,
Okay, you
I'm not
didn't
saying
say
you
that.
have.
That's my interpretation.
I don't think you have to hit rock bottom to improve. I think as a people, we need to be ready and not be apathetic and can't be jamming still no matter what happens. But too many of us jamming still no matter what happens. And if we jamming still, well then, then leave it so, because you're not ready to do what it takes and to
We, we
speak the truth
jamming
to
still.
power.
We jamming
Yes, we jam.
stand because we don't have a problem. Too many of us are in our little bubbles. So we don't have a problem. So we jam in still. So we're not taking that kind of thing on. And my thinking, not an economist at all, my thinking is that things have to get worse before people begin to see that we need to change the way we do business. We're not there yet. And I don't
Well,
see
I
us
get,
getting there.
yeah, but the thing about it getting worse, Denise, really, it could get worse? I don't know.
Yes, it can. Yes, it can. Yes, it can.
I shudder to think what that would look like. No, my father passed away in July of last year. The ambulance took 45 minutes to reach, so he didn't make it. It could get worse.
Marla, that is a very sad situation that you've been in. And it can't get worse for you because you've lost your partner. But there are people who end up with a crime situation and the ambulance doesn't turn up for 4 hours. So it
Never
can
turned
get
up.
it can get worse. And I'm not saying that as something that I hope happens. I'm simply saying
Yeah.
that given where we are and the way things are, it can get worse. Very few of my friends do not have trauma out of some kind of crime. And although our
Yeah.
conversation today is started about the economy and so on, you can't separate it from what is happening in terms of crime. And there's something that I have a concern about. We have what, 500 murders a year? For each murder, it impacts at least 10 persons. Think of it. And if you really think it through, it may
More
impact
than that.
20 people.
Yeah.
Okay, you multiply that. So you see an
Yeah.
annual set of number of people who have trauma. And then you
Yeah.
multiply that over the last 15 to 20 years when crime has been on the uprise. What you're saying is that a significant portion of our population are suffering from trauma. They may not demonstrate it overtly, but they're suffering from trauma and they have real concerns. And one of the things that triggers me is I am not seeing the changes or anything that makes me think that somebody is going to control this. So when I say it
You're
has
right.
has to get worse, that's the thinking behind it getting worse.
You're right. I despair. I despair. I do despair. for my country and for all of us as Trinidadians and Tobagonians. I do despair. I do fear that it's getting worse and it's going to continue to get worse. I don't know what the end game is. I don't know what's being done about it. I can't see what's being done about it. I'm not aware of anything that's being done materially about it. And it's not about the economy, Denise. You know, the other day somebody asked me about what is the growth rate? What is your projection for the growth rate this year? I said, why does it matter what the growth rate is? You think if I tell you 2% or if I tell you 4%, what difference does it make to you? It doesn't make a difference. We are at a point now where the economic variables like growth and debt to GDP and inflation and unemployment really don't matter, because as a society, our social, our human development indicators, our poverty indicators, our social indicators are the ones that are heading in absolutely the wrong direction. If only we would measure it. And we are not doing anything about it. We're focused on the economics. We're focused on getting our whatever inflation down and getting unemployment is understated anyway. It means nothing. Think about Haiti. And by no means am I saying we are Haiti, right? But think about Haiti. You think anybody in Haiti cares what the growth rate is? Or what the inflation rate is? Or what the unemployment rate is? No, because all that matters when there's blood in the streets is the social. Am I going to get food? Am I going to be fed? Am I going to starve? Are my kids going to starve? Are we going to have enough medication? Are we going to be able to go to the hospital if something happens? And that's where I think Trinidad is at a point where the economic variables matter little right now, because on the social side, everything is crumbling.
And Marla, I'm going to ask you a hard question that, but you've just identified a really negative, almost future. If you were in charge, what's one thing you would do?
Well, I would constitute an epoch like Jamaica, and I would get people on the table who are brave and courageous and who are willing to say, this is what needs to be done. Speak the truth to power, hold power to account, and work in conjunction with the authorities, because the government alone can't fix this country. Civil society has an enormous, maybe outsized role to play right now in fixing our country. The private sector has a tremendous role to play in fixing our country. And then you have the multilateral community like the United Nations and so on. And then you have our bilateral partners like, the US, the UK, even our neighbors, even CARICOM. You have to get, and it sounds, I guess what I'm saying sounds like a dream and sounds like a theoretical pie in the sky, but I think that our problems are so large that no one group can solve this alone. And I think that whoever, whenever the government says they're going to do anything, there's nobody holding them to account for it, for having achieved what they said they're going to achieve. And therefore, there is no incentive to do what they have to do. And that's a broken formula. It's a broken formula, and it's been broken for a long time. It's not just this administration, it's successive administrations for decades that have led to where we are today. And it's only because we have so much of an informal, and as we spoke about earlier, Denise, a large informal and underground economy, illegal and legal, that so many people have access to liquidity that keep them afloat. And that's the only reason we are not in a state of complete chaos and social unrest. But, and crime is becoming more, and criminal activity is becoming more and more part of our society's way of living. It's becoming part of who we are.
Wow. That's a hard statement, that crime is becoming part of who we are. And it's not a statement that I'm challenging, because when I even look at little things like people on the streets when they drive, 4 cars go through the red light, a maxi taxi driver breaks a red light. If when he breaks the red light, if something with him who would be damaged, and he doesn't seem to take responsibility for that, to say, well, okay, let me not break the red light. And ever so often we keep hearing things like, okay, we're putting in new systems. There's a lot of advertising these days about the new systems that have been put in, but I am not seeing the behavior change that I think is necessary. you know what role do you see agriculture playing in transforming our country? Do you think we need to expand or increase our agricultural sector?
Absolutely, but I think that we need to think about agriculture in two ways. One, I think we should all, as households, as families, be thinking about how are we, growing our own little garden at home, which is something, I try to do, even just for, the blessed shadow benny. I think shadow benny is like life, right? But I think we need to each think of it as families, but also on a national scale, we need to think of modern farming. I mean, one of the countries that provides the world with food is the Netherlands, and they're more water than land, and they can feed so many of us. So, there's technology that can make it happen and make it easier and make it less labor intensive and make it more efficient and make it um, more productive. That's how we also need to be thinking of agriculture as families, our own little gardens, but also on a national scale in a much more modern way as opposed to the traditional way of farming.
Hmm. And I'm very happy to hear you say that, because I think we have a lot of opportunity, but we're just not seeing our farmers coming together. We're just not seeing agriculture being one of the things that they are investing in and so on.
Well,
Doing.
maybe because predial larceny is real and people will go and steal. I've seen it. I mean, even in my mother had like 150 orchids. And some years ago, she got up in the morning and said, she called me, somebody stole 8 of my orchids. I was like, you have like 500,000 orchids. How somebody stole 8 of your orchids? She knows exactly every orchid. And then somebody told her that they saw somebody on a bike. My mother went down to Tunapuna Market and found the guy who stole her orchids. My point is, if she's just growing orchids for fun and she lost 8, could you imagine a farmer that puts in blood, sweat, and tears, and then somebody comes and wipes out his crop, parts of his crop? Why would he do it? So again, the crime is something that we have to fix as a fundamental.
I wanna,
And
I wanna, I wanna interrupt you, ladies, and ask some questions. I've been listening intently to this conversation, and victimization, I think, is a sort of uh, something that happens that keep people away from standing up for what we should hold the government and the authorities accountable for. You've been hearing about diversification a long time now. We have a lot of we are blessed with resources. I mean, I am delve into the what I call the we music we culture thing, and carnival of it on its own can generate a lot of forex. We have beautiful tourist destinations that can also um, bring in a lot of forex, as we were talking about earlier on. But there are groups who try their best to get the authorities' attention for them to take some sort of action in activating these kind of ideas and putting them into workable systems that can generate better employment and forex and all of that. Now, how do we convince people to come together and stand up and or demand or make the government or the people in authority be accountable for what they're not doing? How what's the remedy for that, Marla? How can we come together? Because it seems as though people victimization is like a halo, and everybody thinks that, beside those who are looking for contracts and things, there are people who would like to voice their opinions on what is happening, and yet still we get shut down. I remember you saying earlier on how they can shut you down and make you look bad and all of that, and make the idea sound not being able to work and all of that. How do we really come together? Um, is it a call from these social groups? I mean, civil society, I like to think about it like that, but there are a lot of NGOs that try hard
Hmm.
and seems to be falling on deaf ears. How? What is there a method to get people to come together?
Well, I think first of all, you can't make people speak up. People have to want to speak up, right? Do we have enough of that in Trinidad and Tobago? I think, unfortunately, I think too many of us are apathetic.
Mm,
And so the problem starts with us, right? Because, like I said, we jamming still. These songs said it perfectly. The Treasury could bond on. We jamming still. Okay, so what better depiction do you want than that? I think too many of us don't care enough. And then those of us who do and are willing to speak truth to power and say things and put our necks on the line are too few. So that's the first thing. Um, in terms of what could get people to come together, I think that there have been, for example, the Chamber of Commerce. There have been groups who have tried to activate and agitate for change, but they're just too few, and you have to reach a critical mass for it to really make a difference. And I guess we just don't have enough. We don't have enough of us who care enough. That's all I have to say about that.
okay, I understand.
If I can just add to that, and a lot of people, we've lost our voices. And I'm not sure why we've lost our voices, because people just tolerate the things they see that are wrong. They tolerate inefficiencies. I'll give you an example. Each person in this country has 7 numbers that are associated with them. Now, if you have 7 numbers, that's your birth certificate, your ID card, your passport, your driver's permit, all of that. You go to any other country, most of them have at least 3, and many of them have 1. Why can't we transform the system so that there is one number that I'm associated with, as opposed to all of these numbers? And the technology exists. So I don't think there are 2 things that I'm saying. One is that I think we've lost our voices as a people. And David, you're quite right. People are afraid of victimization. And the second issue is that the systems and structures, which is what we've talked about earlier on, the institutions are weak, so that there isn't any support and there isn't enough for you to say, well, okay, this is what will happen if I try to do this. People just back off, and as Marla keeps saying, we jam in still.
Yep.
All right. Marla, there's another, in an article that you wrote, you referenced Private Ryan, DJ Private Ryan, and Freetown Collective. And I'm just so curious about that. Was Feel the Love Now? And I just wondered, because I have not seen any economists reference songs like that. And I'm just curious about your thinking. What was your thinking to reference that song? She takes another
I'm
deep
sorry,
breath.
I'm gonna get emotional. Um, no, that song is just, I cry every time I hear it. I think that, our country is so beautiful, and as a people, we are the most beautiful people, but we've lost our way.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't mean to trigger your tears.
Hmm.
I didn't mean to trigger your tears. David, I think you can play that song for us, and then we can wrap up.
Well,
Do you think so?
I cannot play the music while we are on the
Okay.
right.
Yeah,
What?
no, I think that song, and I'm so grateful for people like them, and the creatives and the music makers, the costume makers, everything, all the creatives in our country, because they're the ones through whom we express ourselves. People like me, because like I said earlier, I mean, I could not have said it better than Free Canal, could never say it better than Freetown Collective, could never. And I think that when you've lived in a country that doesn't have that outlet of expression and that level of creativity, we have more talent in our big toenail in Trinidad and Tobago than whole countries have. Okay.
I can understand.
And having lived in a country where we didn't have that, you know, um, you see it for what it is. But it's such a huge blessing. And the reason why I reference that song and other songs when I write is because when I think about anything, I either see a chart or I hear a song. And so when I'm writing, whatever song is in my head is what I will put on paper and hyperlink it or take a quote from it. But that song by Freetown Collective and DJ Private Ryan, that, it's about hope, right? And it's about how beautiful our country is and how amazing we are as a people and how talented we are and how we are so full of love and joy. And my heart hurts and bleeds for my people and my country.
Tell me something before we run out of time. I thought you would have touched on that. With all the challenges that we face as a country, especially where the same forex thing is concerned and thing, but we see a lot of franchises popping up here, there, and everywhere. How are they sourcing their forex to manage all these franchises? I mean, it is even leading to bad health practices because it's not good where your nutrition is concerned. And but you see them popping up all over the place, and they're expanding and expanding and expanding. Yet we have a problem. We talk about lack of forex, and well, it seems like they're creating employment, but to me, it's underemployment they are creating. And we are so blessed, like you said. I mean, like I can understand how you feel where the musical expressions are concerned. I can do hours and hours of a program talking about that because I live that, but it concerns me when you see franchises popping up all over the place. And beside the franchises popping up all over the place, we see what I should say, infrastructural developments that work in their favor, as compared to, like, you come to a village and you see them, like these same arts and stuff, and the infrastructural development that is needed to promote that and to put that on the front burner. You have to beg for it, nobody's listening. But when you see franchises popping up, you see the facilitation in full gear, and it's an effective 100%. you know um, What's your take on this massive expansion of the franchises that is very unhealthy for the young people?
Well, I think that to answer your question on, how come they're getting the foreign exchange to support their business?
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe I'm not making an accusation here, but I'm saying maybe certain people have access where others do not.
And the data says that our increase in non communicable diseases and obesity started when we started having fast foods in this country. The data shows that, you know. So it's a very, very difficult situation. And there's a lot of background thing happening, for people to get some of the franchises that I see. I just wonder. I mean, how do you do that? Why would you have that franchise?
Yeah, I mean, even the KFC, I remember reading an annual report years and years ago that our Independence Square KFC it's ranked very highly globally in terms of how much it sells, and it's only one day a year that it closes and things like that, so we make all kinds of records with that. But I mean, again, who are we? Who's buying the KFC? The government not buying the KFC and the fast food. We are. I think so many times we talk about problems and we like to say it's the government fault, but no, it's us too. We have to look at ourselves. We have to hold ourselves accountable for some of the choices we make.
So, Marla, as we bring our session to an end, what would be your parting comment to our listeners?
Well, that's a difficult one. We have what, a year, just over a year until our next election. I would like to see the authorities on both sides of the political divide talk about how they're going to solve these social problems we have. Non-communicable diseases is one of them, but of course, crime is probably the biggest one. And I would like to see us as a people hold them to account and you run up to the election about talking to us about the issues. Don't tell us about what you think about Kamala or Rowley or who you like or who you don't like or what is why you like them. Talk to us about who's going to do what's right for the country. Have you asked? Do you care? And so my parting message would be, we need to care more because this is ours. Nobody else gonna come fix this for us. This is ours. We have to fix this, and we have to hold each other to account, and we have to hold the authorities to account for fixing it. Otherwise, we jamming still.
Thank you very much, Marla. And Vijamin still has some positive benefit as well. But, I really love the fact that you have talked about Private Ryan and feel the love, and I hope that as we end this session, David, you will play it for our listeners. And I look forward to seeing you all next week when we will be discussing property tax. Don't get fed up because we need to continue that discussion on property tax. Thank you very much. This has
Thanks
been
for
hard.
having me.
Thank you ever so much, Marla. This has been Hard Talk, and we hope that it has brought something to your attention that you will take forward. Bye.
Thank you, ladies. It's been a pleasure listening to you, Marla. I
Thank
like your
you.
ideology and the methods of moving forward.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thanks for having me.